There is perhaps no more spectacular event in the life of a honeybee colony than reproduction by swarming. In this type of colony division, a majority of the workers and the old or a new queen leave the nest to search for a new home. When a swarm issues, the air is filled with the buzz of thousands of flying bees, searching for a queen and a place to cluster. The workers rapidly organise themselves, creating order from what seems to be total chaos, and quickly get on with the business of finding a new nest. This form of female reproduction is unusual for bees, which more commonly reproduce by rearing individual females that initiate new nests on their own. The great advantage of swarming is that the primary reproduction individuals, the queen, get assistance from the workers in building the new nest, starting brood rearing and the foraging. For this advantage, however, bees must invest a tremendous amount of time and energy, and what we are going to do in this session is to look in detail at what goes on in the nest in the lead up to swarming. So we will look at the preparation timeline, the activities in detail and the swarm departure, and see how a colony can adapt to change in internal or external circumstances to give the swarm and the parent colony the best chance of survival. The actual issuing of the swarm is but one brief phase in an extensive process which has gone on in the colony for many months and continues for weeks after the swarm has left. Swarming begins with brood rearing in late winter, and this is fueled by honey and pollen stored during the previous summer's nectar flow. It compensates for the gradual decline in the adult population in winter, as bees will be dying every day until a minimum worker population exists in March. The critical period for the bees is between February and April, and if they can survive through that, there is a dramatic rise in numbers from April onwards, which usually climaxes with swarming in a healthy colony. This graph shows the colony population throughout the year, with the solid blue line the adult bees and the dotted green line the brood. It clearly shows the critical time for the bees, which is here, between February, the end of April, sometimes into May, because the brood is greater than the adult bees. If the weather prevents the bees foraging at this time, they may not survive, as the brood won't reach adulthood. And practically speaking, this is the time when many managed bee colonies die of starvation, so please keep an eye on them until the spring nectar flow is evident, and feed with fondant if they are low on stores. If we look at the graph again and compare a colony that has swarmed, the pink line, with one that hasn't, the blue line, you will see that they generally start and finish the year with roughly the same numbers. So in theory, swarming shouldn't cause unnecessary losses, but it does, even in the wild. Now I know I'm speaking to the converted here, and your bees, like mine, never swarm, do they? But let's have a look at swarming in more detail just in case we need to explain it to a less experienced beekeeper. The earliest swarm I've ever had was about 18 years ago when I was a complete beginner and the farmer had planted oilseed rape all around my house and my newly acquired bees. That was on the 17th of April, as I remember the local beekeeping association having their first spring meeting at my place, and I was very smug, having already taken several supers of honey off. This beekeeping lark is easy, I was thinking. The smugness was wiped off my face, however, when the experts looked in my hives to find many of the queens missing due to early swarms, and I then spent the rest of the spring chasing swarms everywhere. It was good fun and a good learning experience, but I don't want to go through that every year. Most swarms emerge in mid-spring, in say May and June, but there are early swarms evidenced by what I've just said. There is usually a secondary peak in August and September when colonies will swarm again. Swarming is obviously very dependent on the season, weather and geographical regions, as in warmer parts of southern England I have known swarms in February. Most feral colonies living in tree cavities swarm in spring and they only swarm once, but interestingly 40% of the swarms will swarm again at the end of the summer. The direct preparation for swarm begins 2 to 4 weeks before the first swarm issues, during a period when colonies are becoming congested because of the worker population's rapid growth. For a reproductive swarm to issue, colonies must have produced or be capable of producing one or more new queens, so swarming preparations primarily involve the initiation of queen rearing. If developing queens are present in the colony, the swarm can issue. So colonies time their queen rearing to coincide with the population peaks, and you will notice drones present. What signs should you look for when your bees are preparing to swarm? Well, queen cups will be built and torn down throughout the season. Queen cups are shown in the top photograph here. They are the start of queen cells, although there'll be no egg in there and no royal jelly. But in spring, prior to swarming, the builders will build many more queen cups. These will initially be unoccupied, but eventually the bees polish them and coat the inside with propolis. Usually the queen egg lays eggs directly into the cups, but workers have been known to move small numbers of fertilized eggs or even very young larvae from worker cells. Once the eggs hatch into larvae, they are fed on royal jelly. The queen cups will be elongated downwards and sealed at the end of the larval feeding period. Several queen cells will be reared at any time, and cells are frequently torn down by the workers during the larval development period. Often a colony will seal 15 to 25 queen cells prior to and immediately after swarming, although there can be great variability in numbers. The prime swarm most often emerges on or within a day of the sealing of the first queen cell, which is 8 days after the first fertilized egg was laid in the queen cup. By swarming at or after queen cell sealing, colonies are ensured of having at least one virgin queen emerge after swarming. But weather and internal colony factors can alter the timing of swarming dramatically, so that colonies may swarm when only very young larvae are present in queen cells, or after mature virgin has emerged. A colony may destroy queen cells to delay swarming. Usually this is done due to a period of poor weather, to prevent the swarm emerging in pouring rain, for example. Queen cell destruction prior to swarming delays the issuing of the first swarm for a few days, a delay that may improve the chances of the swarm or the parent colony survival. For example, queen cells are frequently destroyed during periods of poor weather, delaying swarms from issuing under cold or rainy conditions. For swarming to succeed, colonies must time their swarming efforts to coincide with the period of growth in the adult population and the presence of enough brood in the colony to compensate for the loss of the adult workers in the swarm. It is notable that queen rearing begins precisely when worker brood rearing is at its peak, and there are almost no unoccupied cells in the central brood area. Thus, colonies time their queen rearing to coincide with the population peak, and a queen cell destruction may serve to ensure colonies do not swarm until there are sufficient adults and brood to populate swarms and the original colony. It has also been suggested that poorer quality queen larvae are destroyed by the bees. This is the sequence of events from initiation of swarming to swarm emergence. It begins with the workers increasing the feeding of the queen, and she, being an egg-laying machine, responds to the feeding by increasing her egg-laying rate. The bees make more queen cups and polish them with propolis, and this encourages the queen to lay eggs in them. The bees gorge on honey and reduce the feeding of the queen, so she reduces her egg-laying rate, as well as reducing her weight. The queen cell is sealed on day 8, and the number of DVAV dances, also known as the shaking signal, increases. The bees become calm and festooning in the colony, and then are aggressive towards the queen, who is chased and chivied around the nest. The bees then perform the buzzing run, and there is a frenzied departure from the nest, with the queen often being pushed out of the hive. Some of the swarm bees will return. Here we can see the swarming countdown for you to watch at your leisure. Other aspects of worker and queen behaviour begin to change prior to swarming. The queen is fed more frequently, as I said, and lays more eggs until about 2 weeks before swarming. When the workers start feeding her less, her egg laying decreases and her abdomen diminishes in weight so that she can fly with the swarm. Workers gorge on honey from about 10 days before swarming to ensure they carry sufficient reserves when the swarm emerges. Queen rearing is probably the stimulus for engorgement, according to Winston in The Biology of the Honeybee. When the swarm emerges, they will be carrying approximately 35 milligrams of honey in their stomachs, compared with 10 milligrams in the stomachs of workers in non-swarming colonies. Interestingly, the workers that stay behind also have fuller crops of 35 milligrams. The workers become relatively quiet a few days prior to swarming, and clusters can be seen festooned quietly on the bottom of combs. Scouting for new nest sites begin at this time, about 3 days before swarm emergence. The workers also shake, push and bite the queen, treating her roughly, which forces her to keep moving around the nest. The queen examines the queen cells frequently, putting her head in the cells, sometimes damaging unsealed queen cells in which she may have previously laid eggs. Generally, swarms issue in the late morning or early afternoon, although there are always exceptions. I've already told you that the crops of the swarming bees contain about 35 milligrams of honey, compared to the average of 10 milligrams in non-swarming colonies. This amounts to about 40% of the total weight of each bee and provides reserves while in transit and at the new nest site when they will need to start building comb immediately. Workers abruptly change their behaviour during the few hours which precede swarming. The rate of DVAV, which is the dorsoventral abdominal vibrating dance, by the way, quite a mouthful, suddenly drops and workers begin running back and forth in waves, buzzing to excite the other workers. The queen is chased, bitten and pulled along with the excited workers. Suddenly a torrent of workers pour out of the nest entrance and take to the air, usually driving the queen out with them. The swarm will cluster on a branch or similar nearby, usually within 25 meters of the nest. So, if you find a swarm hanging on a branch in your apiary, it's almost certainly out of one of your own hives. So don't be telling me a swarm flew in from elsewhere, because I don't believe you. Occasionally, false swarms issue when the queen is not driven out or she re-enters the nest, and in that case, the clustering workers become nervous, take flight and eventually return to the colony. However, if the queen joins the forming cluster, the remaining flying workers join her, and some of them, as I said, will return to the hive. Here we have it, the swarm cluster hanging. That's too high to collect, but if you're lucky, you'll have it there at the right height where you can go and collect it. The buzz and run signals swarm departure from the nest, or also from the temporary cluster location when they will fly straight to their new home. It is the scouts, the older bees, more experienced ones, who run the entire swarming sequence, and it is they that perform the buzzing run, racing through the hive, buzzing noisily with their wings, and this disrupts the activity of the bees, but more importantly activates the dormant bees, telling them departure is imminent. As well as activating foraging, the DVAV dance also regulates queen activities associated with swarming. The number of times a mated queen is vibrated rises rapidly once queen begins, reaching a peak of about 300 times an hour as the queen cell is sealed, but drops suddenly a few hours prior to swarming. This intense vibration of the queen serves to inhibit her activity, possibly to prevent her from destroying the developing queens, according to Winston Gain Biology of the Honeybee. When dancing suddenly ceases a couple of hours before the swarm departs, the removal of the inhibitory effect on the queen's activity may stimulate her to exit the nest with the swarm. Bees also perform the DVAV dance on a sealed queen cell and on emerged virgin queens, although it stops again prior to the departure of the cast, which is a second or subsequent swarm. Now, how can this help you practically? Think about this scenario. You're inspecting a hive and all the signs are telling you a swarm has recently departed. There are lots of sealed queen cells but no unsealed queen cells, and you have to decide which one to leave intact. It's always advisable to leave just one queen cell. If you leave two, there is always a possibility that the first virgin queen to emerge will leave with a cast. Well, we know that bees perform the DVAV dance on sealed queen cells, and this is a good indication that there is a well-developed queen in this cell. So, during the inspection, if you see the bees dancing on a sealed queen cell, that's the one to leave in the hive. Destroy all the others. I have previously called the queen an egg-laying machine who responds to the internal environment of the colony. The queen, as you know, is not in charge, so she doesn't hold interviews before deciding who will form the swarming team, and she doesn't leave the swarm out shouting tally-ho. So how are the bees in the swarm selected? Well, the answer is we just don't know, but the bees do. We do know that the swarm contains a queen or queens and workers of all ages, ending between 30 and 70% of the adult working population. Also, very interesting is the fact that 70% of workers less than 10 days old, leave with the swarm. Make sure you understand what I've said then. It doesn't mean the swarm has 70% of bees under 10 days old. It means that 70% of the bees under 10 days old in the swarming colony leave with the swarm. This is vital if the swarm is going to be successful. It's contrary to what we do when carrying out an artificial swarm as part of our swarm control, isn't it? When we remove the old flying bees and the queen from the brood and nurse bees. So the artificial swarm is artificial in itself, as there are only older forager bees with the queen. Well, that's the end of session 1. If you join me in session 2, we will look at what happens during the swarm departure and includes the temporary cluster, scouting and site selection, departure to the dinner nest and the success criteria and swarming activities. As I'm now living in Spain and giving you these videos for nothing, I'm going to leave a link, and if you want to buy me a beer, you can make a donation to my retirement plan in Spain. Adios amigos.